Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of 3 virtual meetings on the Built Form Rezoning Study. My name is Paul Mogish, and I'm joined by Joe Bernard, Jason Wittenberg, Janelle Widmeyer, and Jim Vole. And behind the scenes, we have Medell Duenas, Dustin Artwall, Sarah McKenzie, and John Lewis keeping things running for this virtual meeting. Our goal today is to present for approximately 30 minutes and then leave 30 minutes open for questions. At any time during the presentation, if you have a question, you can type it into the question feature here in Microsoft Teams. There's a little icon with a question mark. Click on that and you can type in your question. If you're joining us by phone, you can submit questions after the meeting via the Minneapolis2040.com website. And after the 30 minutes of presentation, we'll answer as many of the questions as we can. If we can't get to all of them in the time allotted, we will post both the questions and the staff answers on the Minneapolis2040.com website. Next slide, please. Now, just as you will undoubtedly have questions for us, we have some questions for you. Our job as staff is to propose built form regulations that will be considered by the City Planning Commission and the City Council. And we have 3 questions for you that we think will help us do that. So as you're listening to the presentation, we encourage you to think about these questions. The first is, what suggestions do you have for improving the proposed rules in order to more effectively implement the built form policies of Minneapolis 2040? The second is, what else should be considered in these draft regulations to further the goals and policies of Minneapolis 2040? And then the third question is about some premiums that Janelle will be discussing later on in the presentation. And we want to know if you think these are the right premiums to further achieve the 2040 goals. I'll put these questions up again at the end of the presentation when we get to the Q&A. And if this all seems confusing, no worries. This is really complex. Zoning is not always user-friendly, but we're going to do our best during the next hour to make it clear how to go about reading these proposals on your own time and how to participate in the process going forward. So with that, I will turn it over to Joe to get things started with a brief overview of Minneapolis 2040.
Thank you, Paul. Before we get into the actual built form content that staff has been working to update, we want to make sure everyone is grounded in a common understanding of why these changes are happening. So these zoning code changes are rooted in the policies found in Minneapolis 2040, the city's comprehensive plan, adopted in 2019, and it's been in effect since January of this year. It contains policies and actions that the city will take to support 6 values and achieve 13 adopted goals. Completing a comprehensive plan is required by state law, and the process is undertaken by cities every 10 years. The planning process for Minneapolis 2040 took staff and stakeholders and elected officials upwards of 4 years. It included over 150 public meetings and over 20,000 points of contact with stakeholders. Next slide, please. Among the goals adopted in the plan are that by 2040, the city will eliminate disparities, increase access to housing and jobs, increase affordable housing, support complete communities, and address climate change. Next slide, please. Chief among the policy directions in Minneapolis 2040 is the guidance that governs development of property. This is shown through a series of policy statements and through 2 maps that identify first the uses that are allowed on a given property, whether that's commercial, residential, industrial, etc. We call that land use. And the second map being the map that governs the size, the scale of buildings that are allowed to go on a given property. And that includes height, bulk, etc. We call that built form. Next slide, please. Implementing the built form elements of Minneapolis 2040 is the current focus of our work. These regulations include the height and scale of buildings allowed in each built form district found on that map in Minneapolis 2040. What our process will not cover at this time is we are not re-examining or changing Minneapolis 2040 maps or making policy changes to Minneapolis 2040 itself. This is simply adopting regulations that support those policies. At this time, the process also does not include changes to where, for example, commercial uses are allowed or required. That's work that we will be doing in the future, likely in 2021, 2022. Next slide, please. These changes to our zoning ordinances are intended to bring consistency between our zoning regulations and the policies and maps found in Minneapolis 2040. This consistency between plans and zoning is something that's required of us by state law. Next slide. We started working on this process last year. 2 zoning code changes took effect in January of this year. One was a change that allowed 3 residential units on every property in the city that allows residential uses. So there are no longer zoning districts in the city that are exclusively zoned for single-family use. The second change is an inclusionary zoning regulation. What that means is that new apartment and condominium buildings are required to provide a certain percentage of their units as affordable. Next slide. These standards are critical components of implementing the goals of the city's comprehensive plan, including eliminating racial disparities, combating greenhouse gas emissions, and increasing access to jobs and housing. Minneapolis 2040 is much more detailed than previous citywide plans. It clearly spells out the land use and built form categories for every single property in the city. Part of the reason for that is to create more predictable outcomes for all interested parties during the development process. In the past, there wasn't always very clear policy guidance regarding things like how tall a building should be in a certain part of the city. Minneapolis 2040 changes that. Also, it's been fairly common for developers to submit variances that allow flexibility from certain standards like setbacks and allowed square footage. Our intent is that these new regulations will be applied more rigidly with far fewer variances requested or granted. Next slide, thank you. All the information you need to review proposed changes to the zoning code can be found at minneapolis2040.com. When you arrive at the website, there is a link at the top of the page highlighted in yellow that will bring you to the built form rezoning study content. There you can find background information on Minneapolis 2040, info about events like this, and a tentative timeline for review and adoption of these zoning changes by the Planning Commission and the City Council. Most importantly, information about the zoning code changes themselves are available in a couple of formats, and at the end of the page is a form that we would encourage you to use to submit feedback to us. We understand that there's a lot of detailed content here that we're covering, and we have limited time to do so. We'll be giving a high-level overview of the proposed regulations and their intent here in this meeting, but certainly we encourage you to review the materials in greater detail on the website. I believe this slideshow and meeting notes with the Q&A will be posted online at some point as well. With that, I will hand things off to Jason Wittenberg and Janelle Widmeyer, who are going to give an overview of the changes that are proposed to the zoning ordinance. Jason.
Thank you, Joe. So the first high-level overview topic that we'll look at is floor area ratio. Floor area ratio governs the overall size of a building allowed on the property. I'll refer to it as FAR. And it's a calculation that's based on the size of the lot in which the development is happening. So to arrive at allowed FAR, you take the size of the lot and multiply that by the FAR number. So for example, if a property is subject to a floor area ratio of 1.0, you take the size of the lot and multiply that by 1, and that's the allowed square footage of the building on that site. And here's this diagram on the left-hand side just shows three very oversimplified examples of how a property with an FAR of 1 could be arranged, how that floor area could be arranged. So an architect who's designing a project has to understand how FAR intersects with other rules. In a district that's limited to 3 stories, for example, arranging your FAR within a 4-story configuration would not be an option. Looking at the table on the right-hand side of the slide, these are the base FAR numbers that are proposed in each built form district. In the Interior 1 and Interior 2 districts, we're proposing to keep single-family, duplex, and triplex FAR regulations essentially the same as they are right now at 0.5. And that's the regulation that has historically been in effect for single-family homes since we started regulating FAR for single-family homes. In the Interior 3, just going a little bit farther down to slightly more intense built form districts, we would allow a slightly higher 0.6 for duplexes and 0.7 for triplexes. And in this table, you'll see that each built form district would have a separate regulations based on whether they are paired with residential zoning. That's the R and OR, residence and office residence districts, or whether they're in a commercial or industrial district. So that's where it refers to all other districts. Proposed FAR would be slightly higher in the non-residential zoning districts where you typically don't have setbacks and other things that constrain the volume of a building in quite the same way. So if you look at the row for corridor 4, the FAR for residence and office residence zoning would be 2, and all other districts would be 2.2. As you go farther down the table, you see that FAR increases a bit as you get to higher intensity built form districts. We're trying to closely match the allowed FAR with the height allowed in each built form district. And we've done a lot of data collection for buildings that have been approved at different heights in order to inform these draft rules. Historically, a significant percentage of development projects, as Joe sort of alluded to, have requested variances to increase allowed FAR, and we hope to substantially reduce variance requests while still ensuring that we're only allowing buildings that are appropriate to the planned character and scale of each built form district. One last thing that I'll note about FAR is that our draft regulations propose to include enclosed parking in the calculation of maximum floor area. That would be a change from how we've historically regulated enclosed parking. It has historically been exempt from the calculation of the maximum size of a building. Underground parking, just like any other below ground space, would continue to be exempt, however. With that, I will pass it on to Janelle to talk about building height.
Thank you, Jason. Height regulations govern the overall height of buildings and structures. In the built form overlay districts, the focus of the height regulations is on principal buildings. There is specific guidance in the comprehensive plan for height maximums and height minimums in stories. The maximums are what can be built as of right. In the draft amendment, each district has a maximum height in stories and feet because the height of a story can vary from building to building. There are exceptions to the table that is included on the right. Some of those exceptions are less restrictive, some are more restrictive. Those are described in more detail in the information that's included online. Maximum height requirements are applied where higher intensity building, or excuse me, minimal height requirements are applied where higher intensity buildings are needed to accomplish comprehensive plan goals, but these do not apply in all districts. These regulations work together with the FAR regulations to help achieve the goals of the comprehensive plan. Next slide, please. A request can be made to increase maximum height. In general, height increases are expected to be more difficult to obtain than they are now. The height increase requirements would depend on the location and the type of use. Where requirements for height increase requests will change the most from the current ordinance will be on the corridor, transit, park, and production built form districts. Those districts are shown in color on the map on your screen. In the comprehensive plan, each district has a description that guides the built form of development that may occur in that district. Specific to the corridor, transit, park, and production districts, the guidance states that requests to exceed the maximum height will be evaluated on the basis of whether or not a taller building is a reasonable means for further achieving comprehensive plan goals. To address the direction from the comprehensive plan, height increases will be subject to 3 requirements. The first is compliance with maximum allowed height increase in each district. This means there will be a cap or limit on height increases. This cap is intended to help with predictability and maintaining the intent of each district. The maximum allowed increases for the corridor and transit districts align with the maximum height of the next built form district. For example, the maximum height allowed height in corridor 3 is 3 stories, 42 feet. The maximum allowed height increase in that district that could be requested is for 1 story, 14 feet, or for a total not to exceed 4 stories, 56 feet, which is the same as the maximum allowed height in the corridor 4 district, the next district up. Parks and production districts will also have a cap for height increases. If a height increase request does exceed what is allowed for any district, a rezoning and a comprehensive plan amendment will be required. Both of these applications require a public hearing with the Planning Commission and the City Council. The second requirement for height increase is addressing legal findings. Legal findings are currently required, but they are proposed to be amended to be better tailored to address height increases. These specific findings are included on the website as well. And the findings do allow discretion to be applied. The third requirement is that a minimum number of premiums need to be provided. To further achieve the goals of the comprehensive plan, each premium is tied to 1 or more goals. The height increase premiums have been drafted to be above and beyond what is typically seen in developments. Each height increase request would need to provide 1 or more premiums, depending on the size of the increase. Generally, larger increases will require more premiums. This leads to our next topic, incentives. Next slide, please. As with height, floor area ratio may also be increased by providing premiums. So on the slide here, these are all the potential premiums that could be pursued in order to increase height or floor area ratio. All premiums tied to the goals of the comprehensive plan, whether it's for FAR or height, and they do exceed the minimum ordinance requirements. They're also intended to benefit the surrounding community in some way. They are not intended to be discretionary, so specific standards for each incentive must be met in order to qualify for the premium. And the specific standards that have been drafted are included on the website for review. The premiums are drafted in a way to ensure that they are practical to achieve, but still result in a community benefit. You'll notice some similar types of incentives for FAR and the height increase premiums. But similarly, titled premiums do not typically have all the same requirements when it comes to FAR versus a height increase. The height increase premiums are generally intended to be a little more difficult to achieve than the FAR premiums, so additional standards or a higher threshold usually apply to the height increase premiums. In other words, if you qualify for a FAR premium, you don't necessarily qualify for the height increase premium. One example would be affordable housing. That's an incentive offered for both floor area and height. In addition to meeting the standards for the FAR premium, something more will need to be provided to qualify for the height increase premium, such as additional affordable units, diversity of unit types, or energy efficient units. And just a reminder, the premiums is a specific topic related to one of the questions that we had earlier. So we, again, would like your feedback on whether or not these are the right premiums to further achieve the comprehensive plan goals. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Janelle. I'll talk about lot sizes now. Lot size regulations govern both the minimum and the maximum size of lots. Minimum lot sizes are intended to primarily meet the 2 objectives noted here. First, to recognize sort of practical, functional space requirements associated with different uses. And second, to reinforce existing or desired development or built form patterns in different built form districts. Proposed standards make more use of maximum lot sizes than we have historically done in the past. Such standards limit how many properties can be combined together into a single parcel for redevelopment. So the intent there is to limit the scale of new development by limiting the number of properties that can be combined into a single lot. Next slide, please. I won't go through these line by line, but the lot regulations for 1 to 3 unit buildings would basically stay the same. You can see the minimums and maximums for buildings with 4 or more residential units in the kind of second column from the right. And in the right-hand column, we're showing that commercial uses and mixed-use projects in commercial districts would continue to not have minimum lot sizes, with the exception of certain very specialized uses. Next slide, please. We have a couple of slides to demonstrate examples of maximum lot sizes. This slide shows Corridor 4 policy guidance along Lowry Avenue Northeast. You can see that the district would typically extend about 4, sometimes 5 standard lots from the corridor itself of Lowry Avenue in this case. And with each of these lots being roughly 5,000 to 6,000 square feet, that roughly aligns with our proposed maximum lot size in Corridor 4 of 28,000 square feet. Next slide, please. And in this slide, you see an example of an existing development at 3535 Grand Avenue South. This happens to be on a lot that has a little over 15,000 square feet. That means that this development would be first allowed in the Interior 3 district. The lot itself would be too large of a lot to be assembled in the Interior 2 district. I will turn it back to, I'm sorry, I think next slide is lot coverage and impervious surface, which I will also cover. Lot coverage addresses the amount of a lot that can be covered by buildings, both principal and accessory buildings, so houses, garages, sheds, etc. In the Interior 1 and Interior 2 districts, we're proposing to match the lot coverage standards that currently exist in our lowest intensity zoning districts. And then you'll see that those numbers increase slightly again as the district gets more intense. And we would continue to not have maximum lot coverage standards in our commercial zoning districts. Next slide, please. Maximum impervious surface works in conjunction with lot coverage standards. So not only does it address the buildings, but then any other additional impervious surfaces like walkways, driveways, patios, etc. So it's a slightly higher number than the lot coverage number. But again, in Interior 1 and Interior 2, we're proposing to match the impervious surface standards that currently exist in those lower intensity districts. And then again, no maximum impervious surface standards would exist, as is the case today, in commercial, downtown, and industrial zoning districts. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Janelle.
Our next topic is related to setbacks. Setback regulations, also called yard requirements, indicate how far from a property line a building or other improvement is allowed to be built. Setbacks are utilized to separate uses and structures and are another part of regulating urban form. All built form overlay districts will contain setback regulations. Larger setback requirements apply in the residential areas versus non-residential or mixed-use areas, which at times do not have a setback requirement. Not all yard requirements are proposed to change from what is currently required. In most non-residential and mixed-use areas, the setback requirements are not proposed to change significantly from what is currently required. In residential interior areas, the setback requirements for single, 2, and 3 family dwellings are also not proposed to change significantly from what is currently required. For example, the front, interior, side, and rear setback requirements for a single family dwelling on a pretty typical 5,000 square foot lot that's 40 feet wide won't be changing. In residential areas for other uses besides dwellings with 1 to 3 units, Some requirements will remain the same, but some more significant changes are proposed as well. The changes that are proposed are generally less restrictive than what is currently required. The most significant change proposed is to the interior side yard requirements. These are shown in the table on the screen. Unlike current requirements, the proposed setbacks are based on building height in feet instead of stories. Determining setbacks based on height in feet is a more consistent way to apply a setback requirement, since the height of a story or stories can vary from building to building. The building height ranges used to determine these setback requirements are based on average floor heights for residential projects. I'll use a 3-story building as an example to compare the current requirements to the proposed requirements. The average height of a 3-story residential building is just below 42 feet. Under the proposed side yard requirements, the minimum setback requirement for an average 3-story building would be 5 feet. Under the current ordinance, the minimum setback requirement would be 9 feet. Therefore, the average 3-story building will have a less restrictive side yard requirement. However, if a taller than average 3-story building is proposed, the minimum side yard requirement will likely be greater. This would not apply to dwellings with 1 or 3 units that are located in the interior districts. They are subject to a separate set of interior side yard requirements that are based on lot width, and that's similar to the structure that's currently in place. There are other yard requirements that can apply, including some exceptions. Again, this information is online that covers all the applicable requirements. Next slide, please. Switching gears a bit, the next topic is the Mississippi River Corridor Critical Area, which was established by executive order by Governor Anderson in 1976, the purpose of which was to protect natural, cultural, and scenic resources in the Mississippi River Corridor. In response to concerns about the adequacy of critical area regulations, the state legislature adopted rules that became effective in January of 2017. The intent of these rules is to better regulate the critical area. The city is required by the DNR to adopt a zoning overlay district, maps, and a permitting program for the critical area to implement the rules locally. The critical area has separate districts, each with height, setback, and bluff setback regulations. The built form district requirements will also apply to properties in the critical area, with the more restrictive of the built form or the critical area requirements applying to properties. More information on the critical area regulations can be found on the website, along with maps of the critical area districts that are illustrated on that map on the website. That concludes the overview for the built form topics. I'll turn it over to Paul again to cover process and timeline.
Thank you, Janelle. So I think, as you all know, this is the first of 3 virtual meetings on this topic. The second will be on September 29th, next week. The third will be on October 7th. That third meeting on the 7th will focus on downtown, which is handled a bit differently from the rest of the city in the draft regulations. Now, anytime during the public comment period, you can submit comments or questions on the Minneapolis2040.com website. Now, this slide that you see here says that the public comment period closes on October 19th. We can tell you that this will be extended into November. We don't yet have the exact date, so be sure to sign up for email updates on Minneapolis2040.com, and we'll send that date out when we have it. That email will also include the date of the formal public hearing before the City Planning Commission, at which time anyone will have the opportunity to speak directly to the Commission or to submit comments in writing for their consideration. And of course, we as staff will provide the Commission and the Council everything that we've heard verbatim from everybody in these meetings, and comments and questions submitted on the website. After the City Planning Commission considers these regulations, there will be a vote by the City Council, likely by the end of this calendar year. Now with that, let's go into the questions. We've received a lot of questions. We'll do our best to get through as many as we can, and as I mentioned earlier, we will, any questions that we don't get to, we will answer. We will post all the questions and then follow-up answers on the website following this meeting. First, a couple of housekeeping questions. A number of folks asked whether this meeting will be recorded so that you can view it again later, or so that others can view it, and the answer is yes. We are recording this meeting and we will post it on the website. Another questioner asks, where are the records or transcripts and minutes of all of these years of public engagement that happened for Minneapolis 2040? That is all available on the Minneapolis2040.com website. On the left side, you can click on Planning Process and Received Public Comments and get a full accounting of everything that happened and everything everybody said during those years of engagement. Okay, on to some substantive questions. The first is, it looks like you're retaining low density districts that have minimum lot sizes of both 5,000 and 6,000 square feet. Can we standardize these minimum lot sizes? The 6,000 square foot minimum seems like a relic of an era when the city wanted to discourage new housing, which is counter to the goals of the 2040 plan. Jason will take a stab at that one.
Sure, thank you, Paul. So part of the direction that we received from the City Council when they were adopting Minneapolis 2040 was that generally the neighborhood interiors, where we're going to allow 1 to 3 unit buildings on all residential properties, where we do now allow that the development patterns in the for that type of development should stay essentially similar to how we have regulated those things in the past. And so we have had 5,000 and 6,000 square foot minimums generally in our lower intensity districts. I think it's a reasonable question to ask whether those should be reduced a bit. I believe the number when we did some analysis of the number of residential properties that fall below those minimums right now, it's that about 15% currently do fall below those minimums. But again, our intent is to essentially match the development patterns that exist in those areas, including lot size, but we are open to considering going below 5,000 and 6,000 square feet.
Thanks, Jason. The next question is, it seems like building a triplex in Interior 1 and Interior 2 is impossible with an FAR, a floor area ratio of 0.5, unless each home is very small. And I just want to point out that if you look through everybody can look at the questions who's logged into the meeting here. We received a lot of questions that are kind of along these lines. So Jason, if you could answer that one, please.
Sure. Again, that gets back to the direction that we received from the City Council about retaining those development patterns and regulations that exist in the lower intensity zoning districts. It's certainly a reasonable point that it is not easy to develop a triplex within an FAR of 0.5, just in terms of how the math plays out on that. For a typical 5,000 square foot lot, a 0.5 FAR comes out to, of course, 2,500 square feet. So fitting 3 units into that is a challenge. It is a bit easier if one of those units is either on a half story, kind of somewhat of an attic space, or in the garden level, as neither of those spaces are counted toward maximum floor area ratio. So yes, it is a challenge, but certainly not impossible.
Okay, thank you. The next question. Any impacts from this on the size of accessory dwelling units? Can you add a tiny house on your lot if you have a space? And Jason, when you answer this, maybe you could just explain what an accessory dwelling unit is for folks who may not be familiar.
Sure. An accessory dwelling unit is a sort of secondary unit that we authorized citywide in, I believe it was 2014. They have slightly different regulations than if you were to do a duplex, for example. In terms of specifically the tiny house question, the minimum size of an accessory dwelling unit is 300 square feet. So I know there are tiny house models out there that are significantly smaller than that, but that is currently our minimum size for accessory dwelling units. And at the moment, it's not part of the built form regulations to significantly alter our accessory dwelling unit regulations. There is a separate amendment that has been introduced by Councilmember Gordon to reconsider the requirement that accessory dwelling units be on a property that's homesteaded. But again, that's a separate issue from the built form project that we're working on here.
Okay, a question about the premiums. How do you ensure that a building getting the premium for a grocery store or child care center actually does lease the space to those uses and they don't just sit empty, as sometimes happens when ground floor retail is required but not supported by the market? Janelle will take that one.
That is a question that we have been thinking about too. For those reasons, either market changes or maybe a tenant falls through. So these are grocery stores and childcare centers are two specific uses identified in our comprehensive plan that we need more of in our neighborhoods. So the answer may just be, for a while, we'll just have to see how this goes, or if a project proposes to, establish one of these uses and that falls through and they are not providing it, they may have to come back for a variance. So it's balancing, achieving our goals and then the realities of what happens with the market.
Thanks, Janelle. We'll have another premium question in a minute, but first one about variances. We were told there would be, and this one will be for Jason, we were told that there would be no variances. I have heard 3 versions so far in this meeting. First, far few variances requested or granted. Second, hope to reduce the number of variances. And 3, will be more difficult to get than they are now. They are easy to get now, so easier than now does not suggest that it would be difficult. This language is not in line with the promises made to the public. Can you please clarify?
Sure. I guess I don't recall there being a message that variances would completely become a thing of the past. We legally have to have a route for people to ask for those kinds of exceptions when there are practical difficulties and they meet certain legal findings. But as we have indicated, we have an intent of drafting regulations that can be applied quite rigidly, and that when we have major development projects, it is certainly our intent that the days of those projects routinely having multiple variances would be a thing of the past.
Okay, next question. And this is another premium question for Janelle. I like providing incentives for grocery stores, childcare centers, but I don't understand providing an incentive for skyway connections. It's something developers already want. Why bother rewarding for something they're already going to shoot for?
And with all of these premiums, this is exactly what we're getting at. We want to know if these are premiums of value or not. So I think this is a good question, getting at, like, skyways might not be of value to people, so maybe this one shouldn't be up for consideration. It is currently a premium offered in the downtown district, so it is a carryover from that. But with this amendment, we are looking at our current requirements and have the ability to change that. So more feedback like this is appreciated.
Thanks, Janelle. Another lot size question. Why make a minimum lot size in interior 2 9,000 square feet when there are a lot of sites that are currently R3 to R6, which allows lower lot sizes? Jason.
Sure, we're trying to very closely align the regulations with some specific language that is found in Minneapolis 2040. I don't have the interior 2 language in front of me at the moment, but I believe for properties where we will allow more than triplexes, there is language that says that those would be allowed on larger lots. But then there is the sort of
think we lost Jason. We'll try to get him back. While we wait for Jason to come back, Janelle, let's move on to this question about height increases in interior 3. I'll read that one. Has there been discussion of allowing for height increases in interior 3, particularly for affordable housing? I have seen a number of plots which currently allow for 4 stories and where that are, I think, designated interior 3 in the plan, to the detriment of proposed affordable housing complex. Why is this height max firm, and could that be revisited?
When we were looking at height increases and what requirements would apply in order to request a height increase, we looked at the guidance for the comprehensive plan for interior districts versus the other districts. And for the interior districts, there isn't guidance for height increases in the interior districts. So this indicates that for the most part, height increases are not appropriate in interior districts. A variance could be pursued, but for the most part, there wouldn't be the option to increase height. So in that line of thinking, we weren't thinking about any incentives for increasing height for any reason, even for affordable housing. As you've noted, some of the changes in the zoning will result in a more restrictive height requirement in interior 3 properties. So you just won't be able to build a 4-story building anymore. And so this amendment is, implementing the comprehensive plan. So we're not looking at whether or not particular properties that are now going to be interior 3 are, if that was the right call or not. We're just going with, you could build up to 3 stories as guided by the comprehensive plan.
Just a minute, I'm trying to keep up with all the questions coming in here. Okay, I don't think we have Jason back yet, so let's see. We have heard a lot about promoting home ownership, particularly among persons of color. Why not require owner occupancy of at least some units in duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, and condos in lieu of opening up a landlord bonanza? For the purposes of this process of developing built form regulations, there isn't, our task here is to propose regulations to the Planning Commission and the City Council that are consistent with what was already approved by the City Council and the Comprehensive Plan. And the direction to require owner occupancy is not in the Comprehensive Plan. In fact, there are significant legal barriers for cities to do something like that. So rather, the city's approach to encouraging home ownership is to do that at the programmatic level. So there are programs in place through the housing division of CPED that are focused on encouraging home ownership and connecting people, especially people of color, as this question alludes to, with opportunities for home ownership. So the approach is more on the programmatic side than on the regulatory side. The next question, another one for Janelle on bonuses. I noticed there was an FAR incentive for enclosed parking. Why not offer an FAR bonus for 0 or low parking for larger developments?
With the FAR bonus for enclosed parking, that was, the intent is mainly to look at the benefits of having any parking that's going to be provided on site to be enclosed, which by enclosing parking, naturally would increase the size of the building. There is guidance in the comprehensive plan that all minimum parking requirements should go away. So that was one reason why we're not looking at including a bonus for no parking, because we expect in the near future that requirements or developments won't have a minimum requirement.
Okay, Janelle, I'm going to throw another one at you that is really a lot size FAR thing that would be in Jason's column, but I hope you can take a stab at this one. The 0.5 lot to floor space ratio is a very simple metric. Why not limit total building land use in addition? An example would be 0.25 max land space and 0.7 lot to above ground floor space.
I'm not sure I'm following exactly. I gotta look at it a lot.
Okay. Let me read the question again and see if I can rephrase it. Oh, I wonder, let's see, why not limit total building land use in addition? Oh, okay. I think this is referring to why not have like lot coverage maximums in addition.
I think, yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
And there are lot coverage requirements, but they would be, so this question suggests a relatively small lot coverage requirement and then a larger, potentially a larger building that could be constructed above grade. So we are proposing lot coverage requirements. That's those are current requirements as well, but then being modified to work with the updated regulations. So I think it kind of goes back also to that council direction that we've been given, is that for these 1 to 3 unit buildings, they're supposed to stay at the same floor area ratio requirement that is currently required.
Okay, thank you. Another question we received is, what will be done to protect naturally occurring affordable housing? So again, this is more of a, it's a good question. It's more of a policy question, not really on the table for these particular built form regulations, but I'm happy to take a stab at answering that anyway. So the city, much like I mentioned for home ownership, that there's a programmatic approach to that. The same is true for naturally occurring affordable housing. The city has a relatively new naturally occurring affordable housing program. The acronym that's often used for that is NOAH, N-O-A-H, where funds are available to actually purchase properties, rental apartment properties when they come on the market, to protect them as naturally occurring affordable housing. You know, that's the type of thing, of course, where it's limited by the resources available, but it is something that the city has started doing recently. And I'll add, you know, the relationship between that question and the broader policy framework for Minneapolis 2040, including these built form regulations, is that it's really important that the housing market not be constrained by the city. If the city makes it especially difficult to build housing when the population is going up in the metro area, the affordable housing crisis will get worse faster. Those prices will go up faster. So it's really important that we make the development process predictable, which is part of what these regulations are trying to achieve. Now, if you'll bear with me a minute, I need to go through, take another look at the questions and find some new ones that aren't repeats. So just a minute. Jason, there was a question near the beginning that came in while you were describing FAR, and I think it's a clarifying question about the concept. The question is, how can you have a 1.4 FAR? Wouldn't 1 be the largest? So if you could just clarify what that's about.
Sure. FAR will depend on how many stories there are in a building and how much of the lot is covered. So some of our largest downtown buildings, for example, are in the 16 or 20 or even higher FAR because they are 40 or 50 stories in height. So a 20-story building that would literally cover 100% of the lot for 20 stories would have an FAR of 20. So that's how that calculation functions.
Thank you. There's another question, a general question. Are the overlay regulations being developed now? Are they more or less restrictive than the regulations we have now in the zoning code? Jason, could you take a stab at that one too?
Sure, I would say it's probably not possible to have a blanket statement about them being either completely more flexible or completely more restrictive. Certainly, as we alluded to earlier in the meeting, there is clearer policy guidance about where taller buildings will be allowed. In the past, in previous comprehensive plans, that has not been clear where 6, 8, 10 or taller buildings are supposed to be, that many stories. So in that sense, the built form districts will be more flexible because outside of downtown Minneapolis, we generally have not had zoning districts that are intended to, as of right, allow buildings taller than 6 stories. Now we will have clear regulations that allow buildings in certain locations to be taller than that, and floor area ratio regulations that correspond with that, and therefore are more flexible than we have seen in the past.
Okay, Jason, I'll give you a breather. I'll try to answer this next one. You keep referring to the completed interior designations that were approved, but as there was not information on FAR, height, etc., I think at that time is what this is referring to during the comp plan, the Minneapolis 2040 process. How would anyone have known lots of areas were getting downzoned or reduced heights? So when Minneapolis 2040 does include information about height ranges for each of the built form districts, the questioner is correct that Minneapolis 2040 does not have specific information about or specific guidance on FAR numbers and all of these additional details. So that is very much what is on the table now. So how would you have known that your FAR would change if you own a property? Well, you wouldn't have at the time of the comprehensive plan process. So that's what we're doing right now. And as far as getting downzoned or reduced heights, I mean, to Jason's point earlier, it is a bit difficult to kind of compare the old policy and the new policy because the new policy in Minneapolis 2040 is more specific than previous comprehensive plans. So that's what we're up to now. Next question. Jason, if you could answer this one, where do we see the maps of the R, OR, et cetera districts?
Those districts are currently online. If you Google Minneapolis zoning maps, hopefully the first hit will take you to the locations of current base zoning districts. So the locations of R1, R2B, et cetera. And just to be clear, those base zoning districts are not changing as part of this process. As we alluded to at the very beginning of the meeting, doing a rezoning study to address land use is something that will take place in the future.
And thank you, Joe. Joe just pasted a link to what Jason just referenced underneath the question. but you can also Google it. Okay, Janelle, a question for you. As the city densifies, trees and green are very important. Can we offer incentives for greening of public paths, more urban forest?
We have multiple policies that support, trees and more green space, ecological functions. So yes, I think we can, look at how that might fit into either a premium that we've already drafted or a standalone premium. So good suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question to Jason. How will the regulations assure the variety called for in Corridor 3?
Sure. Corridor 3 is a built form district that is often mapped in areas that are largely single family and two family homes, and we don't anticipate that there's going to be extremely rapid redevelopment of those areas, but it'll be sort of incremental over time. We expect that will be partly what allows us to retain that type of variety that I think you're asking about.
I'm going to throw another question at you, Jason. You've stated that this plan makes development much more predictable. Will there be less green space under this plan? And I wonder what might be helpful here is, some discussion about what's required when a new building is built.
Sure. New buildings are subject to site plan review regulations in Chapter 530 of the zoning ordinance. So those regulations work in conjunction with the maximum lot coverage and maximum impervious surface standards that we referenced earlier in the discussion. And in site plan review, essentially a certain percentage of the lot that is open space has to be landscaped with a certain number of trees and shrubs. There's an actual formula that dictates that. As we alluded to earlier, the Interior 1 and Interior 2 districts, we are proposing lot coverage and impervious surface standards that are matching our current lowest intensity zoning districts. But certainly as the built form districts are more intense and more in close proximity to higher frequency transit, that is when you see those standards of impervious surface and lot coverage increase, allowing more of a lot to be covered by a building. It's certainly something we're conscious of in terms of things like stormwater management, and we're working closely with our Public Works Department to take a look at proposed impervious surface standards and where those would be increased, where they'd be more restrictive in some cases, and what the impacts are from a stormwater standpoint.
Okay, thank you, Jason. In our last few seconds here, I just want to acknowledge a couple of other comments and questions that have come across here. One is I've seen a couple people ask, the way I prefer to consume this information is not on a website, but in a PDF. Will staff be making some sort of PDF that has all this information compiled in it? And the answer is yes. We've heard that from a few people in the last few days. So we are working on that, and we'll be posting a PDF of all of this content on the Minneapolis2040.com website in the next few days. So please look for that. I've also seen a number of comments just saying, could you slow down? This is really complicated. How are we supposed to understand all this stuff? That's really valid, and this is super complicated. And what we can offer you is please keep asking us clarifying questions as you read through this. There is a lot to consume. And you can submit those questions on the website. We are monitoring those questions and answering them as they come in, and we'll continue to do that throughout the comment period. And as I mentioned before, the comment period is being extended, and that date will be updated on the website soon, and we will also communicate that date on the over email. So please be sure to sign up for the email list. With that, that concludes our meeting for this evening. Have a great evening, everybody.